It is now my pleasure to introduce my good friend and my mentor over the past 10 years, Rebecca Watson, who's here to give the first inaugural Gina Guy keynote focusing on celebrating government service. So this is an idea that Rebecca and I brainstormed in memory of Gina, which Rebecca's going to talk more about. And I thought there's no one better to give this inaugural keynote than Rebecca. So pleased to have you here and looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, it's a real honor to kick off the first of these annual lectures on government service in honor of my friend Gina Guy and talk about our careers in the federal government. Now, Wyoming may not be the easiest venue to talk about the benefits and glories of government service. Fed bashing is a particular popular sport in Wyoming. It's a bipartisan enterprise. Unelected bureaucrats, nameless bureaucrats, faceless bureaucrats, and even nameless, faceless bureaucrats are some of the more milder epithets we hear. And of course, it's not surprising after we think about what we heard this morning from the governor and the deputy secretary about the fact that Wyoming's surface, 50% of it is managed by the federal government and 67% of its minerals. And then we have other regulatory agencies that also have a huge impact on Wyoming's economy. And even much of our water infrastructure is managed by the federal government. The Temple has asked me to share my career story in federal government and that of Gina Guy. And my focus really is on the law students that are here in the audience. I'd really like you to listen and consider federal service. And so that's who I'm talking to today. The intangible rewards that you feel from working for government, whether it's federal or state, are something that Gina and I both shared. She was a career employee and I was a political appointee. Gina served for 20 years as a regional solicitor for the U.S. Department of Interior. And we saw Phil Lowe up here today. She served in the position of effectively his boss of the regional office in Denver, Colorado. But she started her career in Portland, Oregon. Gina started as in the Denver office in 1984 and handled a lot of amazingly complex issues in her time in office. She was a recognized federal expert on the Endangered Species Act. She played a key role in amending the statute to allow for private land conservation plans. She also helped the Fish and Wildlife Service with the listing of the Preble's jumping mouse. And that was a listing that really threatened the Front Range development in Colorado. So it was quite tricky. In 2001, Interior Secretary Gail Norton asked Gina to act personally on her behalf to resolve very complex litigation over water rights and the endangered silvery minnow, a fish on the Rio Grande. Gina had earlier served in the U.S. Army for 2 years, and she also helped to transition Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado from their status as defense operations into what they are now, which is a wildlife refuge. Gina ended her federal service in Washington, D.C. by serving 2 years in the Air Force as Deputy General Counsel and a 3-star general. So a really amazing career that made a difference. Gina and I met in Cheyenne, which was her hometown, after I graduated from DU Law School in 1978. Not only were we a small group of women lawyers at that time, Gina was one of 3 women to graduate in the 1975 UW Law School class. So we shared that in common, but we also shared some other things in common. Both Gina and I had fathers that had served in World War II in the Pacific Theater, and their service meant a lot to them and to us as children. Our fathers were both lawyers who worked in state government. Gina Guy's father, George Guy, was the first UW Law School graduate to serve as a Wyoming Attorney General. And my dad went to night law school in Chicago, where I was raised, and he became the Securities Commissioner for the state of Illinois for 20 years. It really wasn't easy being a woman lawyer in those days in Wyoming. Gina was the only woman lawyer in her Cheyenne firm. Marilyn Kite, Chief Justice Kite, that we heard from this morning, was another lawyer at that time. And I was the first full-time practicing lawyer in Sheridan, Wyoming, and really for much of the northern part of Wyoming. And there's a lot of stories I could tell about that, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. But I found Wyoming really to be my land of opportunity to build the knowledge and skills that I needed to serve in government. It was in Wyoming that I learned how to write and speak as a lawyer and understand public land and federal minerals. I was really fortunate to begin my practice, and my first federal job was with the U.S. Federal District Judge, Ewing T. Kerr. I was able to sit in the courtroom and watch the best of lawyers and the some not so great lawyers get up and argue their cases to the judge or to a jury. I was able to read briefs and motions, and through that, I was able to see what was good practice in court, what was good practice in writing, and hone my own skills. But it was in Sheridan, Wyoming, where I moved to begin private practice in 1980, that I began to participate in the community and learn really two important skills. One, public speaking, and the second, how to lead. At that time, I thought I was going to be a securities lawyer. I thought I'd be hidden away in an office and not have to talk to people. But I moved up to Sheridan and found I was going to be a trial lawyer. And so I had to get comfortable in public speaking. So I forced myself to go and speak to women's groups, to stand up and memorize stories about films for a film society in Sheridan, and just look for friendly venues where I could learn how to speak in public. And then I had a lot of amazing opportunities in my 20s to lead. I was on the board of the Fulmer Public Library. I was chair of the Sheridan County Republican Women. I was the president of the Sheridan County Bar. I created and served as president as the first statewide historic preservation organization in Wyoming, and Governor Mike Sullivan appointed me to 2 statewide commissions. Now, a record like that would be impossible to achieve in some place like where I grew up in Chicago. Wyoming was a land of opportunity, as I said. I also had the chance to work on some nationally significant cases that helped me in getting my first political appointment. Whitney Benefits, a Sheridan County charity, owned and had leased a lot of alluvial valley coal. And that's basically coal in river valleys. But in 1977, Congress took a look at coal mining and passed the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act and prohibited the mining of coal in alluvial valleys. Senator Malcolm Wallop, who lived in Sheridan County, was able to put in place an amendment that would allow a company like Whitney Benefits, who had coal prohibited from being mined, to exchange it with federal coal. And that would be a form of compensation. Well, it took 14 years of litigation and negotiation, but that case finally settled, and Whitney Benefits was paid $200 million. And there are many students at this university that have Whitney Benefits scholarships from that money. But through that time, I worked with Senator Wallop to make sure his amendment was achieved, and he became my sponsor. So I want to give you a little context about the federal government so you understand where a political appointee fits into it. There's close to 2 million federal employees, of which at any one time you might have about 3,000 political appointees. And they're in several different categories. The first job I had that I'll talk about at Department of Energy, I was what was called a Schedule C. And this is an employee that's appointed by the president, and the agency where they're going to serve, and that they operate in a confidential and policy role. Later on, as assistant secretary, I was what was called a PAS, and that's President and Senate confirmed. So those are the cabinet secretaries and their immediate subordinates, and there you are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. As required by the Constitution, Article 6, and for the president, Article 2, all federal employees, whether you're a groundskeeper at the White House or a cabinet secretary, swear and sign the same oath. And that is to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. All federal employees also must comply with ethical rules, some of which are criminal statutes. Political appointees have additional ethical restrictions that increase as you move up the hierarchy. One rule for appointees is to avoid what is called the appearance of impropriety. It was explained to me at the time as the Washington Post page A3 rule. Even if it was legal, if it didn't look right, don't do it. So back to my first appointment, the White House Presidential Personnel Office recommended me to the Department of Energy for a position in the Office of General Counsel. And I was very naive at this time. I didn't really understand how Washington worked, but I was eager. So I learned right away a good lesson, the power of my Wyoming sponsor, Malcolm Wallop. I went in to interview with the DOE General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel, and they were both like shifting around in their seats, and they were very nervous. And they said to me, "We don't know what to do here." And then they told me that the DOE Cabinet Secretary, Admiral Watkins, had told them, "You will hire this woman." They said, "This has never happened before." I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to screw up my chance of a job, but I later understood that Senator Wallop, as the ranking member on DOE's authorizing committee, Senate Energy, had vouched for me to Admiral Watkins, and that was enough. I was Assistant General Counsel for Domestic and Energy Policy for the last 2 years of the George H.W. Bush administration. And I really learned so much both about environmental law, but also the use and production of energy. I'll just highlight 2 significant experiences that I had at DOE. First, in 1991, I represented the United States at the United Nations as an expert advisor at the preparatory committee for the 1992 Earth Summit, which was a sustainable development initiative. Then in 1992, I represented DOE at the White House in the final interdepartmental negotiations over the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, regulating coal-fired power plants. On January 20th, 1993, President Clinton was inaugurated as the 42nd president, and I was out of a job. I left DOE with a lifelong interest in energy policy, really good understanding I was not meant for the diplomatic world, and an inclination to avoid working with the Clean Air Act, if at all possible. After a few years, I returned to the West, to Montana, and I made new connections in that state. There I represented statewide timber and mining industries, and later the coal bed methane industry. And I worked pretty frequently with Governor Mark Roscoe. Governor Roscoe then became the chair of the Republican Party during the George W. Bush administration, and his chief of staff, who I worked with, went to the White House Office of Personnel. A former law school classmate, Gail Norton, who had reached out to me during the Bush campaign for information on the Northwest, was confirmed as Secretary of the Department of Interior. This time, I wasn't looking to go to Washington. I'd just been married for a little under 5 years, and we had a really great life in Montana. However, in 2001, I started hearing from Interior and the White House separately, contacting me to interview for a position. In the spring, with the support of my husband, I decided to move forward. This process was a lot more complicated than the Schedule C process. I had to fill out separate, somewhat duplicative, but a little bit different forms for both the US Senate and for the White House. I had to provide a copy of every single article or speech I'd ever given, and I had to give a list of all my clients and all the matters that I had handled. There were interviews at Interior, the White House, US Senate offices, and then a lot of FBI interviews of me and just about everybody I ever knew. And I'm telling you, they asked for information back to your high school days. And I would get lost on the internet at the time, looking for old classmates who I could possibly name as references. And it took a long time. Then on September 11th, the country was attacked. Shortly after that, the deputy secretary called me to find out if I still wanted to come to Washington. The city was still under high alert. There were armed Army officers outside of every agency. They had just installed bomb-proof windows in the Department of Interior, and key government appointees were still traveling to undisclosed locations. My Senate hearing was on December 5th, 2001. And I noted in my testimony that I was honored to have been asked to serve at this time in our country's history, when the events of September 11th have reawakened our pride in America and have underlined the goodness and strength that lies in our singular diversity of our citizens. I told the Senate panel I wanted to address the economic challenges of public land states because how the federal lands are managed has a direct impact on the health and well-being of those states, particularly on more vulnerable rural and reservation economies. My focus was on multiple use management principles. On February 25th, 2002, I was sworn in. At that time, the Assistant Secretary of Land and Minerals had policy oversight of 3 bureaus: the Bureau of Land Management, the Minerals Management Service, which manages offshore oil and gas, and the Office of Surface Mining and Reclamation, managing with the state's coal mining. My budget was over $1 billion. I had 10,000 employees, and everybody working in my hallway was somebody from the last administration. How to get your arms around a job that big? Well, I had some help. First, in 2001, the PAS employees were invited to a meeting in the historic diplomatic reception rooms at the State Department. This is a place where the desk that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence on is located. So pretty powerful stuff. The president was there, President Bush was there, his chief of staff, Andy Card, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of State Colin Powell, and others. Colin Powell's advice on working with career employees was invaluable. He counseled us not to have an us versus them attitude. And he pointed out that there was no way we could accomplish the goals of the president unless we worked with career staff. I followed his advice and worked closely with career staff in the different bureaus I managed, and I found his advice was sound. Second, in 2002, Interior had a retreat with everybody that was political at the Department of Interior. We went to West Virginia to Fish and Wildlife Service facility that they have. And we heard from agency leaders like the Secretary, the Inspector General, and guest speakers like Karl Rove. One of the speakers talked about the need to prioritize in order to accomplish the goals of the president. That sounded right to me. So I set 3 priorities for my office. Vice President Cheney had led an effort to develop a national energy strategy, and 43 of the tasks were under the purview of the 3 bureaus I was supervising. So energy policy became my top priority. The president had a keen interest in forest health and addressing catastrophic wildfires. His Healthy Forest Initiative became my second priority. Secretary Norton wanted to develop a more collaborative relationship between Interior and the publics it served and her 4 C's, consultation, communication, and cooperation, all in service of conservation, became my 3rd priority. Setting those priorities was really important. It gave me boundaries for where I spent my time. It gave my staff clear direction, and it allowed me to say no and pull myself, my focus back if I got off track. Much of my days as assistant secretary were spent in meetings, either internal meetings, external meetings, meetings with people that wanted to come and pitch their case to the assistant secretary. But I had a schedule where it would be 2 weeks in DC and then 2 weeks out in the field. And I went out there both as a surrogate for the Secretary of Interior. I went to talk about policy to public groups, but I also made a point to always meet with the field and regional offices of my bureaus. I wanted to hear from them what their problems were, what they were hearing from the public. They were on the front line. And we can come up with great policies in DC, but is it really working? Is it out there in the real world? I had a lot of great experiences, but I'll just focus on the ones I had in Alaska. I'd never been to Alaska before, and it was just mind-blowing to see Alaska. I'd lived here in Wyoming, I lived in Montana, but Alaska is just another step up in wildness and just the large landscape and how unique it is. I was on the Arctic slope in minus 50-degree weather in the night and dark, because it was dark at that time, all day practically, watching an oil well be drilled, the first one in that area. I also got to go with a contractor for the cadastral survey. This contractor had built a houseboat and he was floating to map the native villages that have been given to the natives at statehood back in the 50s. They still have not mapped all of Alaska yet. It's just amazing. But I floated down the wild Yukon, giant brown bear footprints right where I got out of the boat. Just incredible. And then I also had the chance to open the Iditarod dog sled race. So pretty cool stuff. I also represented the US and at an international mining and renewable energy conferences in Argentina and Scotland. And I did brief the president in the Oval Office with 2 cabinet secretaries and the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality on the Healthy Forest Initiative. And that was really quite an experience. Of course, there were challenges. You go to work with a lot of other really ambitious people with their own political perspectives. And after a time, there were difficult, and I would say very, very difficult internal conflicts. There were also external challenges from media, Congress, states, companies, NGOs, governors, anyone who didn't agree with the president's policies or one of my decisions. Political pressure was applied to influence decisions. Elected officials who wanted the limelight would undercut the administration. And navigating those challenges in a way that you kept your reputation, which I find absolutely essential for a lawyer, was perhaps the most difficult part of that high-level political job. I was at Interior for a little under 4 years, and it was the highlight of my professional life. It was the problem solving that we lawyers do, but with a twist. I wasn't confined like a lawyer to what is. As a policymaker, my job was to figure out what could be. How could I solve that problem? So that was really fulfilling. And I wasn't working for a client. I was working for the American public. And that felt good. So I want to talk about 4 policy accomplishments that reflected my priorities and that have survived the change in administrations. Phil talked about durability. Well, these are 4 examples of durable decisions. The first, when we came in, we weren't really looking at changing NEPA, but modernizing NEPA, cleaning up the procedures that agencies have on NEPA. And I was very keen on seeing greater inclusion of state, local, and tribal governments as cooperating agencies in BLM's land use planning during the NEPA process. The use of non-federal cooperating agencies was in NEPA's rules, but the BLM at that time was not routinely inviting in state and local and tribal governments to sit with them behind the door to help craft land use plans that would really decide the economic fate of those state, local, and tribal governments. So I proposed a BLM NEPA rule that was promulgated in 2005, directing BLM with some significant encouragement in the rule to invite cooperating agencies into the planning process. That rule remains in place, and during the Obama administration, they issued some enhanced guidance document on that rule. Second, I talked about energy as a top priority, and I worked as part of an administration-wide effort to pass the first energy legislation in a decade, the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And that, I have the book, and it's like that thick. So there was a lot of things in it. I was really involved in the Act's rewrite of the Geothermal Steam Act of 1970, the NEPA categorical exclusion presumption for federal oil and gas development, royalty incentives to encourage nearshore development in the Gulf of Mexico, and offshore wind permitting. I also developed BLM's renewable energy program. The Obama and now Biden administrations have built on that renewable energy framework. Third, wildfire remains a huge challenge today, just as it was when it piqued President Bush's curiosity. And the issue of how federal land management agencies can treat or thin fuels to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire is still under debate. I worked with my counterpart at the Department of Ag, Undersecretary Mark Ray, to enact the first forest legislation in 20 years to provide for expedited NEPA and court challenges to forest treatment projects. As Congress considers the need to address public land forests, that statutory framework is still a reference point. Finally, I permanently enhanced the role of the sporting conservation community. Now, these are groups like the Boone and Crockett Club, the National Wildlife Federation, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Pheasants Forever. These are groups that have been involved in conservation for over 70 years, taxing themselves to conserve land and wildlife. I thought they should have a permanent voice in the work that Interior and Agriculture did. So I worked to create a chartered Federal Advisory Act committee for those sporting conservation. The committee has been renamed and slight adjustments made to its members, but it has been rechartered now in the Obama, Trump, and now Biden administrations. And that is a really good feeling to see that. I'm aware that many of you will not choose the path of federal service, but I hope you do. But I want to remind you that as a licensed member of the Wyoming Bar, you too will be serving your country. Like a federal official, Wyoming law requires all members of the bar to take and to file an oath to support, obey, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution and laws of Wyoming. Like a federal official, your work as a Wyoming lawyer is constrained by ethical obligations. The preamble to the Wyoming Rules of Professional Conduct tells us that a lawyer in Wyoming wears 3 hats. One is a representative of clients, second as an officer of the legal system, and third as a public citizen having special responsibility for the quality of justice. As to our roles as lawyers, as public citizens, the rules encourage us to further the public's understanding of and confidence in the rule of law and justice system, because legal institutions in a constitutional democracy depend on public participation and support to maintain their authority. The preamble concludes, lawyers play a vital role in the preservation of society. Wyoming is a unique state. I hope my story has illustrated that. Where you as an individual, even as a young lawyer in your 20s, has the chance to make a difference in your community and state. So I hope that whether you're in federal government or not, that you take seriously our special responsibility to uphold the Constitution and rule of law. So I thank you, and I hope we have time for questions.
Wow, Rebecca, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm looking for a couple of questions in the audience, and my eye is over here on the student table in particular.
Let's break tradition. Have a woman ask the first question. I'm looking at you.
Let's do it.
Salt
I see
Lake
Scarlett and
Scholarship
Iva.
winner.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Iva Reckling, a 2L at the University of Wyoming College of Law. I guess what advice do you have for young women entering the field of law, coming out of law school into this new time?
Well, I wish that there would have been more progress. I thought 40 years ago there would be more progress, but there is more. I mean, there's a lot more women. We now make up 50% of the law school class and 50% of first year, or 45% of first year associates. I think that, my advice is to hone your skills. It's really important to know how to write well. And I think, unfortunately, because just the nature of our electronic society and texting and writing skills are not really where they should be among young lawyers. I also think being able to communicate, whether you're communicating via electronic media or you're communicating in front of a group or a court, you need to be able to communicate. Even if you think like I did, oh, I'm going to be a securities lawyer, I won't need to stand on my feet. Well, wrong. Even as a securities lawyer, you have to communicate and advocate. You're arguing with a client's other lawyers, so you need to be able to do that. And the last thing I would say is, just when you're starting out your legal career, I wouldn't pigeonhole myself too fast. You may think, I want to be a litigator, or I want to do X, Y, or Z. Well, you don't really have any idea when you're coming out of law school. You just haven't had enough experience to know what will really suit you. And I think back to a young associate in my office, and she wanted to be a litigator. And then she didn't really like it. And then she started working for me doing regulatory law, and that was good. But then she moved and started doing transactional law. And there she really flourished and just became a very well-recognized transactional lawyer, went in-house. And so I just say, keep open in the beginning and look for opportunities.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Oh, Scarlett's got a question. All right.
Hi, I'm Scarlett Forrest. I'm a 2L at the College of Law here, and I actually grew up outside the DC area. And one of the things that makes me weary about kind of federal employment and working for the federal government is that it could be frustrating to see kind of the lack of partisanship, or people kind of not doing something pragmatic, but just kind of doing something for the benefit of their party and advancing those goals versus, working, something more pragmatic and workable that would benefit everybody. I was wondering, because you talked about your policies kind of lasting over, multiple administrations, how did you kind of balance any bipartisanship? Is it, once you're in it, not as prevalent, and kind of how do you find that balance?
It's, I think for career employees, and this was something I learned when I went in. I used to think, well, career employees, they've got it made. Once they get into the federal government, then they're there. They don't have to worry about getting fired and everything is great. Well, no, because their political leadership changes on average about every 18 months. So imagine if your boss changed every 18 months. I mean, that's difficult. That's difficult to navigate. And then you have the situation when you may have a change in parties every 4 years or every 8 years. So it's difficult from that perspective, but I don't know. I can only speak for myself. I think there were people at the Interior Department that I worked with that were more partisan than I was. I certainly was partisan. I supported my president, but I also had a keen awareness that I was working not just for the Republican Party, but I was working for the United States. And you try and balance that. You know, it is frustrating, the partisanship. I'm a pragmatic person. I like to solve problems. And I do think the federal government is a place where you can solve problems. It can be frustrating. I mean, I just highlighted the 4 policies that stuck. I could write a longer talk about the ones that were overturned by the Obama administration. And that's hard to see that happen. But I wouldn't discount it, because there's few places other than government where you can make a difference that does last. Clients are case by case, and it's a different scope.
Please join me in a really big round of applause for Rebecca. Thank you.